Hello, everyone. Welcome to Now Next Later for Monday, February 10th. I'm letting the waiting room join the webinar. And obviously, as always, we record Now Next Later and post it to YouTube. So feel free to share and comment on LinkedIn and on YouTube after our show. But today, I'm joined by Suzy Lindblum from Sierra Pacific Mortgage. Suzy is the COO. We were just talking about how to navigate this industry. And, one of my favorite parts of Now Next Later is learning from the experience of those who have been doing this work longer than me. And Suzy, you said you've been doing this work for what was it, 45 years?
45 years.
So I cannot wait to tap into your experience as we have seen, I think mortgage company experience in particular has been fascinating to me. Full disclosure, I've only worked at independent mortgage companies my whole career. So when I joined the industry, it was a retail mortgage company called Norcom Mortgage in the Northeast, and we expanded throughout the East Coast while I was there. And then I went to Quicken Loans, which became Rocket Mortgage. And I saw an interesting statistic that, we've all talked about the march of mortgage companies from a production volume perspective over the last few years. But last year was the highest I think any of us could have predicted. And it is hard to predict and speculate anything in this industry, particularly this year. But CHLA had put out a stat last week that 83% of mortgages were done by mortgage companies last year. And so as you've watched this evolution, as we start to kind of use your experience to dive into the now, what's going on in the market, what is the things mortgage companies should be looking at or doing, what have you seen in that evolution of that shift, and how has that changed your outlook at all?
I think independent mortgage companies have always been, nothing against banks. I actually worked for a bank for 12 years. And so, but I think that independent mortgage bankers have a lot more flexibility, meaning that they're more innovative. They don't have the controls in place that the banks have to, so they can bring in this new technology. And they have, they have a little more flexibility. They're more nimble than banks. So, from that aspect, I think that it doesn't surprise me that more are going to the independent mortgage bankers because consumers, they will always be looking for real estate loans, right? They always want mortgages, but they want it quick. Our society today is instant. I can go buy, you've heard this before. Everybody says this, you can go buy a car in a day. I can buy $100,000 car in a day, but it takes me 30 to 45 days to, and actually much more because you have to figure all that time with the realtor, right? So you're not
Yep.
even counting that. And then you get into the mortgage. So we need to find a way to make it quicker. Now, do I think we need to get it to a day? Absolutely not. That's just not going to work out. Buying a car is different from buying a house. And, you want the consumer to know what they're getting into and know the parameters. But we do need to figure out how to do this more cost effective and with the technology that's coming out.
Yeah, that is the challenge, and one of the hot topics we talk about a lot here on this show. So it's like a perfect segue. Thank you. I'm curious. You've been pitched probably every technology along the way and multiple versions of it, and all of the different things you could think about. In some cases, they want you to even project forward. Well, if you adopt this now, then we could do all these things later. Can
Yeah.
you talk about the mindset that you've adopted and what recommendations you'd have to others in your position, how to approach all of the incoming offers, all the incoming changes in technology all the time throughout your career? What steps do you take now based on that experience, and how would you advise others?
It's interesting because I think probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I was where a lot of people actually still are. And it's the shiny object, right? Oh, that's really cool. Let's go look at that. Let's go do that. Let's go do that. And I saw too many companies, and I always call it the blob. Okay, we have a
Yeah.
blob with you have your LOS, and they have all these vendors attached to it. To me, it looks like a blob with a million arms, and none of the
Yep.
arms know what the other arms are doing. So I took a step back and I really look at when I look at a new vendor, I look at, okay, how's it going to connect with my other vendor? How's it going to connect with my LOS? And how's it going to connect with my process flow? Because I can't have a million arms out there doing a million different things. One, it's extremely expensive. There's so much waste with vendors. And I hate to say that to you, vendors, but there's so much waste that, there's because I get it, you have minimums. And so I'm not going to use everything every time, right? And so I
Mhm.
really look at what am I going to use it for? How does it connect with my LOS? How does it connect with my other vendors? And how is it going to fit in my process flow? And really look at that. And then I measure over, time. Okay, how is this working? How is this not working? And really work with vendors. Too many people take vendors on. In fairness to vendors, too many people take vendors on as vendors. I take them on as partners, and I think that makes a big difference on how you work with them from the beginning.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think you're exactly right. I try to think through, and when I was at Rocket Mortgage, I tried to categorize what is like when you say vendor, what is a kind of commodity service, and
Right.
then what is a technology partner that needs to be able to understand my business, potentially adapt, and then ideally evolve with me. Do you find, or have you found that a lot of what you identified internally and then went out and tried to find the vendor solution or the technology partner solution for it? Or did you find that it was helpful to be made aware of things and say, you know what, I actually do need that? What kind of percentages, or how do you suggest lenders think about like going out and finding it, or welcoming those incoming sales requests? Because that can be a balance.
I agree. And I actually, if I had to put a percentage to it, I'd put 50-50. I
Okay,
really would
great.
because, I know what my needs are, but I don't know what every vendor has. And so as I talk to some, it's like, oh, okay, hold on, this may work. This is a new concept. And uh so I want to say it's probably about 50-50. I will recognize things that I need that I don't have that I actually know about. So I'll go out to that vendor or I'll hear about a vendor. Quite honestly, hearing about a vendor will make me call a vendor faster than a cold call. I'll be
Hmm.
honest with you. So hearing about it in the industry and I'll call them and I go, okay, I hear you're working with this vendor. What are they doing? How's it working? So I actually prefer that over a cold call.
Yeah, that's great advice. Everyone watching, as usual, I like to put some takeaways in the chat and then welcome your comments and questions in the chat as well. So obviously, Sasha was unable to join us today, so I will be manning the chat and we will be looking at your questions later on. So, Suzy, one of the things um, that I'm always curious about is what is the area of the pipeline or area of the process right now as we sit, looking back at 2024, kind of looking ahead to how you have projected out budget wise or roadmap wise 2025. What's the area of the pipeline, area of the process, start to finish, that's kind of the most cutting edge or the most evolving area where you might be looking at things, asking those questions, or you suspect the market is?
You know, it actually, I believe it's more upfront with sales than it has
Hmm.
been. And I actually think that's a good thing.
Hmm.
We tend to want to operationalize a loan once it gets in. But I think the more technology we have up front, like these automated, verification of employment and assets and bringing that income in up front will help smooth the process better. So I think the more we can get, the more data that we get up front is going to make the process go smoother and cleaner.
Hmm.
So, that's where I think that we need that. We need to educate the borrower. Well, first, quite honestly, we need to educate the salespeople on the technology so they can educate the borrowers and the brokers on this technology. A lot of people are still not using that upfront verification of employment and asset. And I think the better we educate sales, to educate that end consumer will be much better, and we can get that data up front and make this process much smoother than it is.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that tension a lot. So, one lever that we can pull is the more you do up front as a consumer, the more you'll
Mhm.
know, the more power you'll have,
Yeah.
the better you can shop. And that kind of pre-approval has, I remember when I joined the industry, the pre-approval was kind of like, I think what they would say is like, it's as valuable as the paper it's written on. Like
Right.
everybody's pre-approval is different. Some of it was stated, some of it was actually verified, and then some of it was like fully underwritten, and there was all kinds of
Right.
different versions. And now we're seeing, like you said, the POS or sort of those upfront links
Right.
getting a lot more. And so we know that's good behavior, but we also know human nature is sort of like, well, I want what I want when I want it. Like I'll get there. Like I
Right.
don't do, nobody does what, like I
Or I
know
don't.
that diet and exercise works, but I still struggle to diet and exercise. So it's like, I get it. So I guess my thinking a little bit here into the question of how much of it is behavioral. How much of it have you seen where the technology's actually kind of let people down in the past, and you're actually asking them to come back and look at it again now that we've actually gotten it more right? And how do you walk through that as like a executive who has to then kind of re-educate sales
Right.
and then thoroughly educate the borrower as well?
You know, so I differ a little. I don't
Please.
I don't necessarily think technology has let us down. I don't think a lot of these vendors have let us down. I think that the ability to do it and do it well has been there. I think it's how we as mortgage companies are approaching it. We tend to want to train operations. You need to
Mhm.
do this, you need to do that. Where we need to train sales and get them to understand that this technology is safe, because they need to convince the consumer that this is safe. So my last two mortgages I did with a company that had this technology. To me, I didn't have to go dig up my W-2. I didn't have to go dig up my bank statements. I didn't have to go print my pay stub. I went in, hit the link, did everything, and it was, oh my gosh. And
Right.
getting a consumer to understand that that is much better than going to find that and sending all that data. Oh, you're sending it over the internet anyway, and it's much safer
Hmm.
if you do it through this. So I don't know if technology has let us down or we haven't trained correctly, because we tend to think, okay, operations needs to know how to get this data and underwrite the loan, right? How to process the loan, underwrite. And we always forget about the salesperson, and they're the ones that talk to the consumer. They're the ones that need to convince the consumer to utilize those.
Yeah, I think that's a great yeah, it brings up a question in my mind because it's a great segue to where we are today to kind of where we're going next. And one of the things I have found to be a challenge for both operations and sales, but mortgage industry overall, is how do I find a way to test this, or how do I find a way to prove it that once I do, I can absolutely show
Yeah.
sales, I can show customers, but the testing and the proving it is so difficult because it almost takes as much time as just implementing it to begin with. How have you dealt with the struggle,
Uh,
stepping into that
I
challenge?
am so glad you asked that, because that is actually a big thing with me. We tend to want to go 100 miles an hour, always. Let's get it implemented. Let's train everybody. Let's do this. I am a big believer that you pick a beta. You pick certain people to help you out. You pick salespeople, you pick ops, and you test it. And because you have to show the success before you implement it. Because if you don't, there's always bugs, right? There's always a problem that you come up with and a process change that you need to do. So you work all that out with a small group, and then you roll it out to the entire company. People tend to want to go 100 miles an hour, and they roll it out to the entire company. And then to your point earlier, you said you have a bad experience, and the salespeople go, not going to use it. Horrible, horrible, horrible. And I know it's not going to work. And so you work out those bugs first and you make sure that you have that process smooth and you show that success and then you roll it out company wide.
Mm. And as you think about the resources it takes, one of the things that comes up on Now Next Later is, you often, for a lot of these new technologies, you need to find an executive champion because they're really the ones that have to sign off on like, I get this and I'm
Yes.
endorsing it. It's, my thing. But then they're often not in that always day to day roadmap or project. Do you have any advice for lenders that how to think about managing it once you've said, okay, we found this thing, we know it's going to solve our problem, we know we want to roll it out in a methodical way that's going to prove success and actually
Right.
work? What's the next step? What's the best way you've seen to kind of manage that, knowing that you can't have necessarily your executive champion way down in there, but you can't have them too far away either. And you got to kind of balance some of that project management. Any advice for lenders listening about how to manage that this year?
I think the days of an executive champion are gone because I think it's an executive team. To your point,
Okay.
I can't have technology only running a process project, right? Because they don't know the process. And so they're going to look at it from their technology brain, and which is totally different than the process flow and what you need from that. So I think that, you need to look at individual projects and you need to decide, okay, who does need to sign off? And then you need to trust your people, quite honestly. So you give them the vision, you tell them what you need, you have weekly check-ins, but you have the appropriate executive team members there from a technology standpoint, from a compliance. I'm going to use those three: technology, compliance, and operations. And then sales, if it affects sales, and everything affects sales, but you don't always need them there. You need to follow up and tell them what you're doing, but you always need technology, operations, and compliance, and make sure that they've signed off on things. Now, too many people forget the compliance side of it. And then, compliance will come in and go, that's not going to work. And you have to unwrap it, and start over again. But I do think it's critical that you have those three.
Yeah, that getting everybody around the table early and often.
Yeah.
I had actually started my career in compliance, so it's near and dear to my heart, certainly. And now that kind of brings us, I think, to the challenge of everyone who is trying to follow the best practices. You mentioned earlier, and I really like the visual of it, is you've got your blob, you've got your LOS, this giant standard of truth that is also your process. It's
Right.
both things. It's your source of truth and your process in the same thing. And then you have all these arms, and they don't always talk to each other. And
Right.
so now you've in the process, and you're doing one arm at a time or a couple of arms at a time. And one of the questions I have as you think about what's next, to bring it up in the mindset, but we can also bring it up in sort of the investor regulatory, but that's uncertainty. And what is interesting to me about this moment coming up this year is that we've really felt percentages of production to be either purchase or refi. Markets are one or the other. And I'll say 80-20, right? So we're in a market, it's 80% refi, 20% purchase. Or we're in a market that's 80%
Mhm.
purchase and 20%. And it feels like this year it's much more 50-50. It's much more, we have some life events that are creating cash
Right.
out refis, and we have the typical purchase that comes with life events and markets,
Right.
the 4.5 million transactions or whatever it is. So as you're looking ahead to pipeline that is kind of split and a market where it's like the phrase I've been using for 2025 is we'll see, we don't even
Yes.
know. And navigating that, is there anything you're doing differently this year than any year before? Is there any way that you're looking at this differently than you ever did before, or am I overstating the uncertainty of 2025 and this is the mortgage business and we'll get through it? What's your take on that for executives?
So I do look at each individual year as a separate
Okay.
year, but
Hmm.
I try to look again, I've been doing this for 45 years. I've been through so many markets that, you can't look at what's going to happen this year. You need to look at, okay, I'm going to have my ups and downs and adjust for that and know that your system needs to adjust as the market flows. If it's to your point, if it's 80% purchase, 20% refi, and now it's 20% purchase and 80% refi, you need the technology that will flow with those market adjustments. And, if you don't have that and you spent all this technology on everything about purchase, I mean, what would have happened to you in 2020? Then you're
Hmm.
scrambling, trying to get caught up again. So I think that you have to have the vendors and the process to be able to adapt to either and to quickly adapt to the market changes.
Yeah, I agree. I really like that. Is there anything that in your experience, particularly now sitting in that COO seat, is there anything you're looking at weekly or monthly that's a good indicator, that's a good flag, or that you would recommend folks like me or other leaders in your seat look at to try to get a little bit of a head start on things? I know, for us on what I would call, the fulfillment technology product side of the house, it's not always rates. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
you can get caught in that as a salesperson, looking at the rates on a hour by hour, day by day basis. And I think a lot of us on Now Next Later and a lot of the technology companies have expressed to me, it doesn't always help to look at it that way
Yeah.
from the back end. So is there anything you do look at? What are some of the things you look at to kind of get a little bit ahead of how those pivots come at you?
I read all the reports. I look at, all the stats that are coming out about the
Okay.
millennials are finally coming of age. You
Hmm.
hear the phrase, they're finally getting off of mom and dad's couch, they're getting married. Uh, you know, so I try to stay from it from that standpoint because again, I've been doing this a long time. I did mortgages when they're 18%. People buy houses. You're always going to need mortgages. And we were actually quite busy when it was 13 to 15%. That was the
Hmm.
norm back then. So, people are always going to buy houses. So what I really look at is what's happening with the age groups, what's going on. I read this interesting stat. A lot of millennials are buying houses not because they have a family, because they have a dog.
Yep.
And it
I've seen
makes
that.
sense. They want a yard for their dog. They don't want, and people like dogs, people like cats. I don't want to leave the cat people out.
Yeah.
But, so I look at more of that than I do rates because again,
Hmm.
people are always going to buy houses. Now your refis are going to change with rates. That's where you're going to have the rates, but people are always going to buy houses. Now I think that COVID put us in a whole new uniqueness, and people, you had quite honestly, we've had a 2-year recovery from COVID, right? People didn't know
Hmm.
that was so drastic that people kind of hesitated. I think that you're going to see that growth again in 2025 and really 2026. But I think it's
Hmm.
going to be the millennials, they want a house. They're getting married, they're having kids, or a lot of them are buying together now. You
Yeah.
hear a lot of that too. It's I can't afford housing by myself, so I'm going to go in with my best friend. And I think you're going to see some of those trends. So that's what I watch is those trends on human behavior versus rates.
I agree. I think that one of the most fascinating trends I've been keeping an eye on is the co-buying together trend you mentioned. And I do think data and technology have evolved rapidly enough that we've gotten pretty good at dashboarding as an industry, but also just like as technology companies, even more broadly than mortgage, real estate, consumer finance, consumer shopping, a lot of that data, even at the credit card level, which isn't great, is still pretty good. It's trying to
Right,
categorize entertainment versus this versus that. And so buying a house with a friend versus your family or by yourself is a lot easier when you can see everything. And so
right,
companies are getting pretty good at showing this is what everybody's paying, this is what the breakdown is,
right.
and you can apply separately. I was also fascinated. There was a company I worked with a little bit in the Bay Area called Nestment, who leverage the fact that Fannie and Freddie can already do it. This, we talk a lot about mortgage product innovation on Now Next Later, and it is an innovation in the sense that we haven't sold it that way very
Right.
often. But you could do 3 or 4 millennial co-borrowers today under the
Oh,
guidelines.
yeah.
Like, as long as your systems are prepared, for how
Right.
you're entering that, for how you're gathering that personal data, there's nothing stopping you from loan delivery. So that's a great example where if you just want to think through what can I market, what can I pivot to that I
That's
can
right.
already do, you brought up a great example.
And I think there's a lot of millennials that don't, they don't know enough about co-borrowing, right? And if we
Hmm.
did advertise that, if we went out and really talked about that, I would have done it as a,
Me too.
single in my 20s. I would have bought with a friend. It
Hmm.
just makes sense versus paying rent all the time.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we like to do is we like to end on sort of that forward looking, what is down the road for mortgage companies. This trend you mentioned among consumer buyers is a great one. Do you have any trends for operations, for fulfillment, for the mortgage product, loan delivery space that you're saying, like, I'm really keeping an eye on this? We're not digging in yet, but I think this is an area that really needs your attention for the Now Next Later audience. What would that be?
So I love new technology, so that helps, and I'm not scared of trying new things. So AI is fascinating to me.
Yep.
I've used AI. I think that we're finally going to get to where we can, and this is silly, but it's so important. Index loans better than we've ever been able to index loans. Now that sounds like such a minor part, but think about it. One of the biggest complaints of consumers and mortgage brokers is they have to send documentation that they've already sent because somebody can't find it, right? And it's
Yeah.
all about
Yep.
indexing. And so, you have AI there, calculation of income. We have vendors out there, one of your sponsors calculates income through AI.
Yep.
Being able to calculate income, being able to index, being able to take some of that AI, and I call it this stare and compare. How many times have
Hmm.
you had a processor? Okay, I've got to look at this and I've got to look at my system. Do this, does the data match? AI is going to take care of that. And
Hmm.
a lot of people are scared that AI is going to take our jobs. I remember in the 90s when DU and LP came out, oh my gosh, the world blew up. We were never going to need underwriters again. We need underwriters more now than we ever needed them. So I'm not scared that AI is, I'm not one of those people, oh, AI is going to take it. I think it's going to make our jobs easier. Nothing to me is more tedious than looking at a document and comparing it to another document or a system. So I think that, AI is really going to come in and take those minute processes that quite only they're minute processes, but they have such a huge impact that it's going to change and make things better.
Yeah. I agree. I've tried to use AI more in my personal life just to get used to it, to get comfortable with that. Is
Right.
that something you do as well? Do you
I
use it as a
do.
search, as a tool? Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I actually got a subscription to it, and there's some great products out there, like Gamma app. If you've ever heard of
Okay.
Gamma, it's it builds PowerPoints for you.
Ah,
It's
yes.
incredible. So yeah, I do a lot on my personal, and uh, I I use it daily. I use it
Yeah.
daily, and you have to worry. One thing about AI is uh, it's not perfect. It's going to get it's like any computer, it's going to give
Yeah.
you, and if people feed false data into it, so you can't just take it and go. You have to look at it, you have to determine what's right, what's wrong, make adjustments. But I do think it's the future, and I think it's going to hopefully finally get us to where we have much better processes.
Yeah, I agree. I kind of sometimes talk about it a little bit like how email didn't necessarily change the fact that there are still letters and phone calls and
That's
other
right.
things, but became this like really important tool and we communicate differently, but it didn't necessarily put
Right,
anything else out of our lives. It just kind of changed. And AI is in a sense like it's going to do all this stuff. You're still going to have to manage it. It's still going to be
right,
your tool, but it's going to do all these other things that you don't have to do
right.
anymore. And then we'll go from there.
It's
Well, that's
it's
a
like the
perfect,
microwave. It's a perfect
yeah,
microwave oven. It just makes it faster.
yeah, just makes it.
Maybe not necessarily always good, but faster.
Well, thank you so much. That is a perfect place to end. You mentioned our sponsor. Thank you. We are presented today by Prudent AI. So thank you, Prudent AI, for sponsoring Now Next Later. And we ended on AI. So I think they'll be happy about that. But I'm really happy that you and I got to speak because Suzy, I learned a ton from your experience. I can't wait to keep talking to you and be connected to you and go from there. But thank you. This was a great episode. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. Have a
Have a
wonderful day.
wonderful day.
You too. Take care, everyone. We'll talk to you next week.